I've recently finished the second draft of my work in progress, Alexia Legends 2, and since this is the first true sequel I've ever written, I learned quite a few things from the process. So I thought this would be a good video topic to make, just sharing some of the things that I've learned of the differences between writing a standalone or the first in a series and a sequel novel. So the first thing is the characters. Continuing the story of an already established character has been quite different for me from writing a character who is new to the reader. Because the readers will already have a really strong sense of who this character is, it makes a few things a little bit different when it comes to writing about them. Something challenging about this is keeping the characters true to themselves while still allowing them room to grow. I knew from before I began writing the first book in my Alexia Legends series that this was going to be a series, so I intentionally left room for my characters to grow as the series continues on. They're kind of like little houseplants, you know? When you first get them, they're in a little tiny plastic container, and then as they continue to grow, you have to keep transferring them from larger to larger containers. By the end of the first book, they have grown into their new container, right? So then once you start the second book, you have to transfer them into a larger container, so to speak. We're staying with this plant theme. So yeah, that is something that I was careful of and made sure that I would always be allowing space for them to change and grow as characters as the series evolves. And while I was outlining, of course, I also have to keep this in mind to make sure that I have more to build on next time. This is mostly done by having them figure out their trauma, and then inflicting new trauma that compacts with their old trauma to make things even worse. Seriously though, it's just really different from writing them the first time around. When you're working with the same characters in a new story, every choice that they make is not only affected by the backstory that I've created behind the scenes as a writer, but also by the backstory that is the previous books in the series that the reader has experienced along with them. It's a small difference in theory, but in practice I have found that it actually is pretty different feeling from every single decision you have them make. You have this whole backlog of decisions they've made before, and it just feels more not stressful, it feels more important. Every choice that I decide to have them make is also based on all these other choices that they made in the past that the reader has experienced along with them, and that just makes things a little more complicated. I find that it does make lots of little things like this more difficult. So next, on to world building. I personally didn't find that much of a difference in world building from this book to its predecessor, but I think that mainly comes from this being a fantasy book. A lot of the places that the reader and character have been before don't have to be re-explained, but then all these new places that they're going to do have to be explained. So I guess there are slight differences in making sure the reader remembers the details that are important about the places the characters go that they've been before in the story. So the things that have stayed the same that the reader already knows about are pretty easy to re-explain to them and remind them about this is why, this is like this, or whatever. Having some already established settings actually makes things easier for me to build upon at some points. And since I already had the general rules and the rules for magic already laid out in this world, I actually found it easier in places to create and expand upon the world that they're already in. And of course for the reader this makes things easier because the learning curve for the magic is much lower than it is in the first book because they already understand how the basics work. And for that portion, it was more a matter of explaining the obstacles than it was getting the reader up to speed on how the intricacies of the magic actually work. Next is writing style. When you're writing a standalone or the first book in a series, your style can kind of be molded to what will best fit the story and the world. But then once you start moving on to next books in the series, you kind of have to stick with that in a lot of places. There are always differences from one book to the next in a series, even just reading other books, not my own work even. You notice differences in tone and differences in some style, but a lot of it does stay the same for a series. And so that is something that I wasn't super conscious of before I began this series. So now there are places where I would say my writing has improved, and there are certain ways that I would say things that I want to say things, but I don't feel like they necessarily match the writing style and tone that I've already created for the series. So that is somewhere that I'm kind of finding a struggle. My writing style has definitely evolved since I finished the first book, but it's not so drastic that I feel the need to constantly change things. I do worry just maybe a little bit that readers will notice sort of a difference in tone, but I'm working really hard in the editing phase to make it more seamless between the books. I have found myself while I was drafting this book and doing my first round of revisions that the tone is different. The style is a little bit different. So now that I'm getting into more refined edits, I am going back and really making sure that it matches well with the first book in the series. I'm not too worried about it though, because I do know that the tone of books can change book to book in a series depending on anything that is happening, depending on the plot, depending on which characters are even being focused on. So that is something that I've noticed is different and has caused me a bit of trouble. And the last kind of category is where to remind readers of things. So something that subsequent books in series require is little reminders here and there for the reader about who someone is, maybe who they're related to, how this particular piece of magic works, what happened when they went to this place that was a bad thing. Just all these little details that you might not remember from the first book around, but that become important later on in the series. So during my first draft of Alexia Legends 2, I never included any of this information in the first draft because I thought it would just be easier to add it at the end once I had all the story elements in place and I was sure things weren't going to move around. It was only after my first big pass of editing that I realized how much of this stuff is really required for a sequel novel. I mean, I expected, paragraph or sentences sprinkled here and there throughout chapters, but there are a lot of places where it is just required multiple times a page, especially near the beginning of the book, to remind the reader about things that happened. And a lot of this was actually pointed out to me by my critique partner. Something I was worried about during those first developmental edits were that I would add too much of this. Going into the edits, I knew that reminders about what had happened were necessary for a sequel. I guess I just didn't realize just how many of them you actually need. And figuring out where to place them, how to place them, and exactly how to write them into the story seamlessly is a new skill that I had to learn for editing this book. And of course, every time I do this, I hear in the back of my head Jeff Probst saying, "Previously on Survivor." There is something that I considered doing for this book, but I'm not even sure if I'm going to. I think it's the inheritance cycle. Has, in the beginning of books 2, 3, and 4, they have a recap of what happened in the previous books so that you can be caught up before you start reading. I've asked a few people about it, and while some people like them or find them helpful, like myself, quite a few people despise them. I think it's because more intuitive readers will read these descriptions of what happened last time and be able to pick out the information that is going to come back later in this particular story. And I think that kind of gives some readers sort of a spoiler, or quite a few spoilers at points. If, in the summary of the last book it mentions that this one character's dad was missing or whatever, then you know that that'll probably come into play in the next book because they won't give you, in the summary, information that is not important because it's supposed to be only the important information. So I can kind of see where that would come from, I guess, that you wouldn't want to read that or you wouldn't want that included because you might feel like you're getting information before you have it come naturally within the story. If you'd like to start reading in the world of Alexia, you can check out Age of the Gods, which is a free short story I have available on my website, which I will link down below. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider subscribing and ringing the bell as it helps me out. That's all I've got, so thanks for watching. Bye!